There's something strange that happens when a man is waiting for a phone call. Not the kind of waiting he talks about. The kind he hides. The kind where he checks his phone without realizing it. The kind where every vibration changes his heartbeat for half a second. The kind where he tells himself, "I don't care anymore," and then looks at the screen again. And maybe that's why you're here, because somewhere inside you there's a woman you can't fully stop thinking about. Maybe she pulled away. Maybe she became distant. Maybe the conversation died and you still don't understand why. Or maybe nothing dramatic happened at all. Maybe she simply stopped reaching toward you. And that silence started speaking louder than her words ever did. Before we go further, if you've ever had a moment where someone's absence felt heavier than their presence, subscribe. Not because subscriptions matter more than people, but because these conversations are for the men who are tired of pretending they're unaffected. Now, let me tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. Most men who want a woman to call them are not actually waiting for a call. They're waiting for relief. Relief from uncertainty, relief from wondering, relief from the feeling that they somehow lost something valuable. And the mind does something fascinating when it wants relief. It starts creating stories. Maybe she's busy. Maybe she's testing me. Maybe she's confused. Maybe she's waiting for me. And every story feels better than the truth you don't want to face. The truth is, you don't know. And human beings are terrible at sitting inside the words, "I don't know." Especially men who are emotionally invested. Especially men who have built an entire future inside their imagination. I've spent years studying human behavior, not just professionally, personally. I've sat across from people whose lives looked successful from the outside, but were secretly controlled by one unanswered message. One woman, one relationship, one possibility. And the strangest part? The woman wasn't controlling them, their attachment to the outcome was. That's where the real trap begins. Because the moment your happiness becomes dependent on a specific phone call, a specific text, a specific person choosing you, you stop living in your own reality. You begin living inside theirs. You wake up wondering what they're thinking. You go to sleep wondering what they're feeling. Your emotional weather changes according to someone else's forecast. And at first, it feels like love. But often, it's fear. Fear of losing something. Fear of not being enough. Fear that if she doesn't come back, it means something about your worth. And I want you to notice something. Right now, as you're listening, what if her calling you and your value as a man are completely unrelated? What if those two things have been tangled together for so long that you can't even tell where one ends and the other begins? Because that's what happens. A woman stops reaching out, and somehow a man begins questioning himself. Not his phone, not the timing, not the circumstances. Himself. Maybe you know exactly what I'm talking about. You tell yourself you're being patient, but underneath patience is anxiety. You tell yourself you're detached, but underneath detachment is hope. And hope can be beautiful, but hope can also become a prison when it's attached to a single outcome. Here's the irony. The harder you stare at the phone, the further away you move from the version of yourself she was most likely attracted to in the first place. The man who had direction, the man who had presence, the man who wasn't emotionally collapsing every time life became uncertain. And this is where things begin to shift. Because the law of attraction isn't really about forcing someone to call you. It isn't about magical thinking. It isn't about convincing the universe to deliver a person to your doorstep. It's about something far more unsettling. It's about becoming aware of the emotional signal you're living inside every day. And most men never realize what signal they're actually broadcasting, not to women, to themselves. And what happens next changes everything. The human mind has a habit that almost nobody notices while it's happening. It chases what feels missing, not what is present, not what is working, not what is already here. What feels missing? And once your attention locks onto something absent, it starts behaving like a magnifying glass. A small uncertainty becomes a major emotional event. A delayed reply becomes a mystery. A quiet afternoon becomes evidence. A normal silence becomes a personal rejection. The woman may not even know this process is happening, but inside your mind, An entire movie has already been written. Scene after scene, conversation after conversation, future after future. And the strangest thing? The movie feels real. Real enough to affect your mood, real enough to affect your confidence, real enough to affect the way you walk into a room. I once spoke with a man who couldn't understand why he felt exhausted all the time. His work was fine, his health was fine, his family was fine, yet every day felt heavy. Eventually, he admitted something. The first thing he thought about every morning was her. The last thing he thought about every night was her. And throughout the day, there was a constant invisible question running in the background. Has she reached out yet? That question was consuming energy, not because it was difficult, because it was unfinished. The brain hates unfinished emotional stories. It keeps returning to them, again, 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 looking for closure, looking for certainty, looking for an ending. But life doesn't always provide endings when we want them. Sometimes life simply gives us space. And space is where people reveal who they really are, not to others, to themselves. Because when no message arrives, when no phone call appears, when nobody reassures you, you finally come face to face with the relationship you have with yourself. And that's the conversation most people spend years avoiding. You see, many men believe they miss the woman. Sometimes they do. But sometimes what they miss is who they became around her. The excitement, the possibility, the feeling of being chosen, the emotional intensity, the hope. Remove the person and suddenly you discover that the feeling you were protecting wasn't necessarily love, it was identity. Part of you started defining yourself through her attention, and when attention disappears, identity starts shaking. That's why silence can feel so painful, not because silence hurts, because silence exposes. It exposes every insecurity you managed to keep hidden while things felt good. It exposes every fear you distracted yourself from. It exposes every place where your confidence was secretly borrowed instead of built. And here's where most men make a mistake. They respond to this discomfort by trying harder, more checking, more waiting, more analyzing, more imagining, more emotional chasing, even if they never send a message. Even if they never make contact. Inside their own mind, they're chasing. And people rarely understand how powerful that internal state becomes. Because your emotional focus changes your behavior long before it changes your circumstances. You become less present, less grounded, less attractive to yourself. That's an important phrase, attractive to yourself. Because before anyone else feels your energy, you do. Before anyone else experiences your confidence, you do. Before anyone else sees your value, you do. And if your entire emotional state depends on another person validating it, you'll constantly feel unstable, like standing on a floor that keeps moving beneath your feet. Now here's the uncomfortable question. What if the reason you keep thinking about her isn't because she's the one? What if it's because she's become the symbol of something you're afraid you can't create on your own? Connection, excitement, meaning, love, validation, hope. Because once a person becomes a symbol, you stop seeing them clearly, you stop seeing reality, you start seeing projection, and projections are powerful. They can convince you that your future depends on one person, that your happiness depends on one outcome, that your peace depends on one phone call. But deep down, a quieter voice already knows something different. A quieter voice knows that no phone call can permanently solve what only self-respect can heal. And the moment that truth begins settling into your chest, something unexpected starts happening. The emotional grip begins to loosen. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough for you to breathe again. And that's exactly where the real shift begins. Not when she changes, when you do. There's a moment that arrives quietly, so quietly that most people miss it. Nothing dramatic happens, no revelation, no lightning bolt, no sudden transformation, just a small realization. A realization that the person you've been waiting for has been occupying more space in your mind than they occupy in your actual life. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. At first, it feels almost embarrassing. You remember how many conversations you've replayed, how many possibilities you've imagined, How many times you've mentally rewritten the same story, hoping it would finally make sense. You tell yourself it was because you cared, and maybe that's true. But caring and clinging are not the same thing. One comes from affection, the other comes from fear. And fear is incredibly creative. Fear can turn silence into rejection. Fear can turn uncertainty into disaster. Fear can make a man believe he's losing something that was never fully his to begin with. I want you to picture something. Imagine a man standing in front of a closed door. He keeps staring at it, every day, every night, wondering if it will open, wondering who's behind it, wondering what could happen if it finally swings wide. Meanwhile, behind him, an entire world exists. Opportunities, experiences, growth, people, life. But he never turns around, because he's convinced the answer is behind that one door. The tragedy isn't that the door stays closed. The tragedy is that he stops living while waiting. And this is where many discussions about attraction miss the point entirely. People talk endlessly about techniques, timing, messages, strategies, psychology, as if attraction is a puzzle to solve. But real attraction has always been connected to something much simpler: life force, presence, emotional stability, a person who feels connected to himself. Think about the version of you that felt most alive, not the version who was desperately waiting for someone's attention, the version who was immersed in something meaningful, the version who laughed without forcing it, the version who wasn't measuring his worth every hour. That version of you carried a different energy, not because he was pretending not to care, because his life was larger than one outcome. Women notice that. People notice that. But more importantly, you notice that. And here's something fascinating. The moment you stop treating someone's attention like oxygen, you start breathing differently. You stop monitoring every emotional fluctuation. You stop looking for signs everywhere. You stop interpreting every silence as a verdict on your value. And the mind becomes quieter. Not completely, just quieter. Enough to hear truths that anxiety kept drowning out. Truths like, maybe her distance isn't about you. Maybe her confusion isn't about you. Maybe her timing isn't about you. Maybe every unanswered question doesn't require an answer. That idea can feel frustrating, because the mind loves explanations, the heart loves certainty. But maturity often begins where certainty ends. Sometimes you simply don't know why someone pulled away. Sometimes you never receive the explanation you think you deserve. And somehow, life continues. Not because the pain wasn't real, because your future was never meant to depend on information you may never receive. I think that's one of the hardest lessons for a man to accept. The realization that closure isn't always given. Sometimes it's created, not by understanding the other person, by understanding yourself, by recognizing that your peace cannot remain hostage to someone else's choices. And this is where the law of attraction starts being misunderstood. People assume it's about attracting a specific person, but at its healthiest, it's about alignment. Alignment between your thoughts, your actions, your identity, your emotional state. Because when those things are aligned, something changes. You stop approaching life from scarcity. You stop acting as though love is rare, as though connection is rare, as though one person carries all the meaning. And when that scarcity begins fading, an unexpected confidence starts emerging. Not loud confidence, not arrogant confidence, the kind that's almost invisible, the kind that comes from knowing you'll be okay either way. And strangely enough, that is often the exact moment life starts moving again, not because you forced it, because you finally stopped gripping it so tightly. I want to tell you something that most men never say out loud. Sometimes the hardest person to let go of isn't the woman, it's the future you imagined with her. That's the part nobody talks about. Because when you think you're missing someone, you're often missing a version of tomorrow. The late-night conversations that never happened, the trips you pictured, the memories that only existed inside your head, the relationship that felt so real emotionally, even if it never became real physically. And losing an imagined future can hurt just as deeply as losing a real one. Sometimes deeper, because reality has limits. Fantasy doesn't. Fantasy is perfect. Fantasy never argues with you. Fantasy never disappoints you. Fantasy always says exactly what you hope to hear. So when reality fails to match the story you've built internally, it can feel like something precious has been taken away. But nothing was taken. Something was revealed. And there is a huge difference between those two things. You see, life has a strange way of exposing the places where we're emotionally invested in outcomes we cannot control. And every time that happens, we're given a choice. Not an easy choice, a meaningful one. Do I continue chasing certainty, or do I learn to trust myself in uncertainty? Most people never realize how much emotional strength is hidden inside that question, because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. It always will. The human mind wants guarantees. It wants proof. It wants signs. It wants reassurance. It wants to know exactly what's going to happen next. But confidence was never built from guarantees. Confidence is built from surviving situations where guarantees never arrived. Think about that for a moment. Every period of genuine growth in your life probably started with uncertainty. You didn't know if you would succeed. You didn't know if things would work out. You didn't know if you were making the right decision. Yet somehow you kept moving. And that's what made you stronger. Not certainty, movement. The same thing applies here, because the man who sits frozen, waiting for a phone call before allowing himself to feel happy again, has unknowingly handed over his emotional freedom. He's waiting for permission to relax, permission to smile, permission to feel worthy, permission to move forward. And nobody should have that kind of power over your inner life. Nobody. Not because people are bad, because they're human. Human beings are inconsistent. They get confused, they get distracted, they change, they grow, they leave, they return, they make mistakes. If your peace depends entirely on their consistency, you'll spend your life feeling unstable. This is why some men become trapped in cycles that last months or even years. They're not waiting for a person, they're waiting for emotional validation. And validation feels wonderful for a moment. But the problem with borrowed confidence is that it expires. The moment attention disappears, so does the feeling. Then you're right back where you started, searching again, waiting again, needing again. The cycle repeats. Until one day something clicks. One day you realize that self-worth built from another person's attention is like building a house on sand. No matter how beautiful it looks, it won't feel secure. Because deep down, you'll always know it can disappear. Real confidence feels different. It doesn't come from being chosen, it comes from knowing your value remains intact whether you're chosen or not. That distinction changes everything, because now you're no longer approaching relationships from desperation, you're approaching them from abundance. You're no longer thinking, I hope she calls so I can feel okay. You're thinking, I'll be okay whether she calls or not. And that emotional shift is far more powerful than most people understand, because it changes the energy behind every interaction, every decision, every thought, every expectation. And once you genuinely reach that place, something unexpected starts happening inside you. The waiting begins to lose its grip, the obsession starts weakening, the emotional noise starts fading, and for the first time in a long time, you begin hearing your own voice again. And when your own voice finally becomes louder than the noise, that's when everything changes. Not overnight, not in some dramatic movie scene, just quietly, naturally, like a fog slowly lifting from a road you've been trying to navigate for months. You wake up one morning and realize you didn't check your phone first. You were thinking about something else, your life, your goals, your day. You catch yourself laughing at something and notice that for a few seconds, you completely forgot about her. And strangely, instead of feeling guilty about that, you feel relieved. Because deep down, you've been exhausted, maybe more exhausted than you've admitted. Carrying hope can be heavy when it's mixed with fear. Carrying uncertainty can be exhausting when it's mixed with attachment. And carrying someone in your mind every day, especially someone who may not be carrying you in theirs, can slowly drain parts of you that deserve to be invested elsewhere. This is why the most important shift was never about attracting her. It was about returning to yourself. Returning to the parts of yourself that existed before the waiting began. The parts that had dreams unrelated to romance. The parts that felt alive without needing constant reassurance. The parts that knew how to create meaning instead of searching for it in another person's attention. And here's where something fascinating happens. The moment a man truly reconnects with himself, he becomes different. Not because he learned a new technique, not because he mastered some psychological trick, because his emotional center moved. He's no longer standing outside himself looking for evidence that he's enough. He's standing inside himself. That difference is enormous, and ironically, life often responds differently to people who stop chasing. Not because the universe is rewarding them, because their behavior changes, their energy changes, their decisions change, their conversations change, their presence changes. They stop communicating neediness, they stop radiating fear, they stop treating every interaction as a life or death test of their worth. People feel that, including women. But here's the part I hope you remember long after this video ends. Maybe she calls, maybe she doesn't. Maybe the message arrives tomorrow. Maybe it never arrives. Those possibilities are real. What matters is that neither outcome gets to decide who you are. Because your value was never hiding inside her decision. Your future was never trapped inside her response. Your peace was never supposed to depend on a ringtone. I know that sounds simple, but for many men it's one of the hardest truths they'll ever face. The realization that the thing they've been chasing isn't actually a person. It's a feeling, and once you learn how to create that feeling within yourself, the desperation begins disappearing, the fear begins loosening, the waiting begins ending. Not because the world changed, because you did. So if you're sitting alone tonight, phone nearby, mind wandering, wondering whether she'll call, wondering whether she'll think about you, wondering whether there's still a chance, I want you to consider a different question, not will she reach out, but who am I becoming while I wait? Because that answer matters far more than any phone call ever could. And here's the beautiful part. The moment you stop making your happiness dependent on a single outcome, you become free. Free to love without clinging, free to hope without desperation, free to care without losing yourself, free to move forward. And sometimes, when a man reaches that place, life has a surprising way of bringing the right conversations back into his world. But whether they return or not, he no longer needs them to complete him. He's already whole. And that's the moment he stops waiting for life to begin. Because he finally understands it never stopped.